Resolution 3060 came to our committee as a constitutional amendment that would require the Legislative Assembly to establish the State Ethics Commission as it relates to legislators, statewide officials, and candidates. As introduced, the commission would consist of 5 members, but no more than 2 members from the same political party. The Ethics Commission must be granted the authority to recommend legislation and must include statutory authority to examine campaign conduct, campaign finance and lobby activities laws, initiate investigations, and impose civil penalties for violations of campaign conduct and campaign finance laws, lobbying laws, and violations of other ethical standards. It would also grant subpoena power and staff to be hired. The GVA committee voted 10-4, do not pass. Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
Is there any discussion?
Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
Oh, you may continue.
Thank you. There's a difference between the terms ethics and laws. Ethics are matters of right and wrong, rules of conduct and moral code, which are not always punishable. Laws are codified, enforced by government entities, and violators are punished. North Dakota Century Code covers election law in Section 16.1, spelling out what is restricted. According to this bill, the definition of campaign conduct or other ethical standards can only be defined in statute. If this commission must define ethical behavior standards through statute that it may propose and this body would pass into law, then those, quote, ethics become laws. So if we codify ethics, they're no longer ethics, they are laws for which we already have enforcement mechanisms. The question was asked, what real, not perceived issue are we trying to solve with an amendment to our Constitution? What we learned is that there's a perception that our state may be suffering in the court of public opinion and that this amendment would possibly silence critics. We learned that our critics are typically some members of out-of-state media, and further it was acknowledged that perception is often reality, even when the perception is wrong. The majority of the committee determined that anecdotal reasons and false perceptions, rather than actual issues in true reality, did not warrant amending our Constitution. Some states have what has been referred to as a culture of corruption. In our state, we have a culture of openness and accessibility. North Dakotans will not always agree with the decisions made by us as a body or we as individuals, but research shows that our citizens are overwhelmingly satisfied with the work that we do as it relates to other states. Again, the GVA committee recommends a red light on HCR 3060, and we ask the Assembly to concur.
Representative Stranden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would urge a green vote on this bill. It wouldn't be this body that would be creating the Ethics Commission. We would be sending it to a vote of the people, and then we would know once and for all whether or not the people really do think that there needs to be an Ethics Commission. So I usually support things that go to a vote of the people because I feel like it's more democratic, but please vote green. Thanks.
Representative Hawken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. We had a couple of opportunities earlier in the session to pass some legislation which would have given us the governance over ourselves, and we chose not to do that. And I think that is one of the reasons why this is before us today. I was not in committee, but I was assured that the bill was going to be amended to something that I felt comfortable putting my name on. The amendments were not accepted, and I find that troubling because I think you should always have a vote on amendments. Over my 20 years here, I've noticed a change, and it's a very sad one. The speeches on the floor are not always factual as they should be. The statistics are not always accurate, and those are ethics too. I mean, campaign contributions, those kind of things. I think we need to take a look at ourselves and say, are we doing what we say we're doing? Because I don't think we always are. And that makes me really sad, because North Dakota deserves what we think we are.
Representative Casper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to correct the previous speaker's statement. There were no amendments offered to the committee formally. The bill presenter proposed an amendment that we consider. We had a motion before the committee and a second before there was any motion for any amendments to be considered. And the motioner and the seconder did not withdraw their motion, and we had a vote. That's what occurred in committee. So the amendments were not asked to be considered by the committee. So we want to get our facts straight, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Is there further discussion? Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would the bill carrier yield to a question?
Mr. Speaker, I
Representative
will.
Lauser, will you yield the question?
I will, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it was a thorough hearing in the testimony, or in the hearing, very thorough with several questions. I guess my question, after hearing the bill carrier explain the bill and the committee's decision, is whether or not the committee, because there is a clearly recognized a problem with perception, whether or not the committee discussed what would be required that would warrant the need for an ethics commission. If there was no evidence of actual problems, did the committee discuss what they would look for, that what would have to occur that would warrant the need for an ethics commission in the state?
Representative Lauser.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Mock, as we understood the bill, the commission would have that authority, but it would only be in what is currently in statute under law. So it would, the only thing that the committee would be able to investigate as the bill was written is what would be proposed into law, which is already addressed by other mechanisms.
Mr. Speaker, may I?
Representative Mock.
Would the bill carrier yield to another question?
Representative Lauser, will you yield to another question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, well.
Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't. Maybe I didn't explain it properly, but my question to the bill carrier is: there is a problem of perception that was explained by the bill carrier, but it was explained that there was no individual problems that warrants the need of an ethics commission. My question is whether or not it was discussed what it would take in order for an ethics commission, for the need of an ethics commission to be demonstrated, to warrant the need of an ethics commission. Would it take a certain number of arrests or allegations? That's the question I'm asking, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lauser.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Mock, we did not discuss arrests or number of incidents. In my floor speech, I was only referencing the discussion that we had, and you as the prime sponsor had mentioned the perception that our state is under, so I was recognizing what you had mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's no secret I've brought this proposal before this assembly in some regard over the last several sessions, because it's an issue that is really important to me. In fact, the question of ethics is so important to this body that in our own rules, we state that if public confidence in the Legislative Assembly is to be maintained and enhanced, it is not enough that members avoid acts of misconduct. They also must avoid acts that may create an appearance of misconduct. That's in our own rules. It's the only set of rules that govern us as a legislative assembly. And Mr. Speaker, as was presented in the committee, there are 42 commissions overseeing government agencies, legislatures, executive branches, judicial branches, vendors, lobbyists. All but 8 states have an ethics commission. And in fact, North Dakota is the only state that does not have an oversight body. We are the only state. It is not a question that there is an act that warrants the need for this. Why would we wait until something so egregious occurs that we suddenly create the authority to oversee the actions of elected officials throughout the state? And this is not just about the Legislative Assembly. This is about the executive branch, appointed and elected officials, candidates. In fact, the amendment that I offered to the committee at the very beginning of the hearing would have extended it even to the lobbying arm. And I would have been open, had the committee been willing to work with this, to extend it to any other level of government that the committee would have felt so appropriate. Mr. Speaker, over the last 7 years, elected officials, and I hesitate to say this, Mr. Speaker, because it's been asked throughout that hearing to name instances of misconduct or of alleged misconduct or even the perception of misconduct in the state. Between the legislative and executive branches, there have been 3 arrests regarding domestic violence. There have been 4 incidents involving alcohol, including DUIs. It has been not uncommon for sitting legislators to lobby in other states for organizations that lobby in North Dakota while serving in that position. And even one of our colleagues, not in this chamber, received nearly $2,000 in foreign campaign contributions in the last election cycle. What are we doing that addresses the perception of ethical misconduct? The fact that we don't have a commission or a committee means we cannot clear any action that could be perceived as unethical. That is the point of this, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that this chamber, that this assembly, will move forward the proposal that allows voters to say yes or no, we as a state should have an ethics commission. And then, and only then, if the people agree, do we come back to the 65th Legislative Assembly and we work on that very issue, that we create the commission that we have control over, that we set the jurisdiction. I believe that is the appropriate method of addressing this issue. I think it is good public policy. I hope that we can support Senate or House Concurrent Resolution 3060 and take our name off that unfortunate list of having no oversight in the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there further discussion? The House has before it for final consideration House Concurrent